The Skull, written and narrated by yours truly. The students knew why Mr. Turner kept a skull on his desk. For 2 decades, the plastic model sat. When supervised by him, the students were allowed to hold and study the skull. Many students found it difficult to believe the decoration was made of plastic. It looked so lifelike, yet was dull and lightweight like the material it was composed of. At some point, the skull became a mascot for the beloved middle school English teacher. Mr. Turner was well liked by students and his colleagues. He was in his 50s, unmarried, no children. His students did well, each passed his class and got reasonable marks on their standardized tests. No one asked for after-school tutoring, so he was one of the first teachers to leave the building. Also, Mr. Turner somehow had a way with calming unreasonable parents. His colleagues constantly asked him for advice on how to do this. Over the years, students were becoming more unteachable and parents more unreasonable. Teachers were quitting at unprecedented rates because of this. Despite giving the best advice he could, calming unruly parents was a rarity for the other teachers. After another failed attempt, Turner's colleagues lightheartedly joked about him practicing witchcraft. No one could stay angry at a man who never raised his voice. Fights were disarmed as soon as Mr. Turner entered. The teachers and administration marveled at the aura of calm his classroom projected, his melancholic voice keeping the students focused and attentive. Mr. Turner was often sought out by other schools and offered administrative positions, higher pay with less work. He always denied, stating that he was happy where he was. When asked, Mr. Turner was always happy to share the origins of the skull with his students. He was hiking during the last summer he believed he would be a teacher. He'd been teaching for 5 years at another school out of state. Mr. Turner was overworked, overstressed, and underpaid, regretting his career choices, resulting in hatred towards his job. Then, hints of white and gold caught his eye. Off the trail, between a cliff and a small cave-like enclosure, was a skull. It was dirty, but the sunlight had illuminated it just right for him to find it. He held it in his hand, stared at it, and started crying. Before the end of summer, he found his current position. He packed his belongings and moved out of state. Since then, the skull has remained, a reminder of why he became a teacher and the time he almost gave up. The students adored this story. Some even credited the skull for their successes. Whenever they struggled in class, they looked at the skull and remembered that they almost didn't have Mr. Turner. Their persistence paid off, and Mr. Turner would beam and congratulate them. One day, the skull disappeared from Mr. Turner's desk. His first class of the day went ballistic. Some ran out and searched the hallways for the skull. Mr. Turner quickly called them back, calmed his students, and produced the skull from a drawer in his desk. Relieved but mortified, the students demanded an explanation. That morning, Mr. Turner was told the skull was no longer welcomed. The new principal felt that due to current events, the skull was offensive and distracting. The students were outraged. In between classes, a group of students went to lament to the principal. After school, at least 3 dozen students lined up to complain. Fed up, the principal told Mr. Turner to put the stupid skull back on his desk. The students, and even some teachers, rejoiced. A week after the debacle, a student passed Mr. Turner's class. He was leaving his animation club, his Lego set in one hand, his phone texting his mother in the other. His distraction was interrupted by a bright reflection, hints of white and gold fleeting in the corner of his eye. The student stood in the doorway of Mr. Turner's class. Across from him, the teacher held the skull in one hand, holding it to eye level while cleaning it with a cloth. Mr. Turner's mouth was moving, slowly and mindfully. The student couldn't hear what his teacher was saying. Curious, but uninterested, the student continued towards the stairwell. His mother was late picking him up today. He was one of few remaining students on campus. He tried playing a mobile game, but his mind continued to drift. He couldn't bear it anymore. Although his mother was at least 3 blocks away, the student gathered his things and returned inside the building. Mr. Turner and his belongings weren't in the classroom, yet his door was open. He was one of the few teachers who didn't lock his door after hours. The skull sat on the desk, meeting the eyes of the student. Sunlight radiated from the freshly polished plastic. Thoughtlessly, the student approached it. He dropped his belongings to the floor next to the desk. His hands reached out and touched the skull's round top. Adolescent fingertips grazed the surface. It wasn't perfectly round, nor was it smooth. The skull had bumps and ridges. It wasn't like any plastic skull he felt before. Now that he looked at it closer, the textures looked more real. Was this one of those lifelike models Miss Parks had in her science class? Strange, but knowing the origin of the skull, it wasn't strange for Mr. Turner to have something that wasn't exactly a toy. Now, where did that gold color come from? The skull was always white. There wasn't a gold hook or spring on it. The eyes weren't hollow either. There were 2 black plastic sheets fitted inside the sockets. Mrs. Parks taught him to use the scientific method to deduce strange questions like this one. Mimicking Mr. Turner's actions, he picked up the skull with one hand and raised it to eye level. He almost dropped the object. In the 3 years he's been a part of Mr. Turner's class, he knew the eye sockets were plastic. He himself pressed his finger against the barrier, preventing him from penetrating the eye socket. Now, suddenly, they were hollow. Did the plastic finally break? Did Mr. Turner remove them and throw them away? No, because if the plastic was gone, he would have seen a dull cream color. Instead, there were 2 dark voids where the back of the skull's head should have been. Inside the right eye socket was a mysterious, glimmering, golden object. It radiated and pulsed, growing brighter and brighter the more he observed it. He'd seen something like this when watching a documentary in Mrs. Parks' class. However, that was CGI. Here it was more brilliant, more beautiful, more radiant than anything he's ever seen in his life. A star, a golden star floating somewhere in the night sky of the skull's head. This was something only astronauts experienced, or scientists who worked on those billion-dollar telescopes in Florida. And here it was in its hand, expanding in the darkness, growing brighter in excitement, swelling in anticipation. It gleamed in the pupil of the boy's dark eye, dancing, shimmering, twirling as its size grew, threatening to overtake the entirety of the eye socket. The boy's other hand reached up, his mouth agape, corners twitching upwards. The closer his hand drew to the star, its size and magnificence flourished brighter and brighter. The boy's fingers reached the eye socket. An hour later, his mother was crying next to his hospital bed, his hand bandaged. He was unconscious from severe blood loss. When the boy woke up, the doctors explained the accident. He was found 2 blocks away from school property, near a house with a faulty fence. The dog that ate his hand was long gone. He promised his mother he would never leave campus without waiting for her again. Mr. Turner returned to school the next day. He was called into the principal's office and congratulated on his recent raise. He went to his classroom and noticed that the skull was out of place. He smiled, picked it up, and returned it to its proper position on his desk. Only in his class did the students refrain from gossiping about the rabid dog that ate the boy's hand. After school, the new transfer student asked about the skull. She was allowed to touch it and pick it up, amazed by the story of the skull's discovery. After examining and poking at its plastic eyes, curiosity satiated, she thanked Mr. Turner and returned the decoration. He said she was welcome and sent her on her way. For the next 10 years until his retirement, Mr. Turner would polish the skull once every year. His students would continue to do well, and his colleagues would continue to ask for advice. Entitled parents and students would drive his young colleagues to quit within their first 5 years. Turner kept his yearly pay raise a secret to avoid outcry among his co-workers. If someone found out, they instantly forgot. Every year a student would get seriously injured. Some went blind. Others lost limbs. A few disappeared and were never heard from again. Afterwards, Turner was called into the principal's office and received his pay raise. He would continue to turn down promotions and new positions, remaining at his humble teaching position. During his retirement until his death, the skull remained by his side, located on a desk in his home office, polishing it every year. When Turner died, the skull was claimed by the government. As per his wishes, he had no next of kin, so the skull was sold along with the rest of his possessions. An art teacher bought the skull to add to her model collection. She was struggling to find her way out of the education system. She stored the skull next to her other models, locked the classroom door, and went to her car. But something beckoned her to return to the room. So she did, and went to the cabinet containing the models. She removed the skull and held it to eye level. She polished it with a microfiber cloth and spoke to it slowly and softly. The teacher placed it on her desk and left for the day. The next day, a female student would suddenly lose both her eyes.